All right, ladies and gentlemen. So for this video, we're going to discuss another of our organic macromolecules. But in this instance, we're going to talk about the organic macromolecule lipids. Now, the thing about lipids is that you actually commonly refer to them as fat. So most of the things that you associate with fat are actually lipids. And so that's going to be an important thing to sort of keep in mind. Now, fat, which is like plant oil, like olive oil or vegetable oil, and also animal fat from like meat and, well, meat because that's from animals. That stuff is lipids. They are not the only kind of lipids, but they are lipids, all right? So lipids are a little weird in terms of our organic macromolecules, insofar as they have very different types of monomers. So we talked about carbohydrates. The monomer for carbohydrates is monosaccharide. Now, you could have a lot of different monosaccharides, but they're all monosaccharides. They're all basically sugar polyhedrals, all right? Whereas when it came to nucleotides, which we talked about next, every nucleotide had a sugar, a phosphate, and then they just had a different nitrogen base. That was it. Whereas when we're going to talk about some of the monomers of fatty acids, of lipids, we're actually going to get into some structures where there's some variety, real variety. They look different, okay? So the first monomer of lipids is actually something called a fatty acid. And there's two types of fatty acids. You'll see a saturated fatty acid, which means it has no double bonds, okay? And this means that every carbon is bonded to four things. This actually causes a straight chain, and you can see that in the diagram to the right, is that the chain for this is very straight. You also have unsaturated fatty acids. And unsaturated fatty acids have at least one double bond. And that one double bond gives the fatty acid a kink. And you can see here in the diagram, the red circle, they're circling basically the same section. And you can see how in the saturated fatty acid, there's just the carbon is all single bonds, they're all bonded to everything. But in the unsaturated, the carbon has this double bond right here between the two carbons. And that actually causes the chain to kink a little bit. Now what this does is this means that the unsaturated fat has slightly less energy in it, and it actually means that your body has an easier time breaking it down and using it. That's why unsaturated fatty acids are actually better for you. The weird thing about saturated and unsaturated fatty acids is that saturated fatty acids are solid at room temperature. And unsaturated fatty acids are liquid. So what's really interesting is when you look at olive oil. Well, olive oil, when it's at room temperature, just sitting in your cabinet, is it a liquid or is it a solid? Because that'll tell you which kind of fat it is. Whereas if you look at, you know, a steak and you see that section of like white fat on it, if you just have it sitting there before you cook it, is it solid or is it liquid? Because that'll tell you what kind of fat it is, saturated or unsaturated. And in general, animal fat tends to be saturated and plant fat tends to be unsaturated. Now down here we also have another monomer of fatty acids, just called glycerol. Glycerol is a lot like Vaseline. It's very like smooth and slick, very resistant to water. And it actually has some structural uses. Now, at the bottom here you can see there's another monomer, which is actually a very common structure called cholesterol. You actually find cholesterol everywhere inside your cells, specifically the cell membrane. So anytime you ingest cells, you're ingesting some cholesterol, which is a problem health-wise because you don't need any more. You are fully able to make your own. Cholesterol is really only a monomer unit. You can see right here, especially if you consider the diagrams of nucleic acids that we looked at or carbohydrates. Cholesterol is a very complex molecule. It's big. It definitely is a macromolecule. There's a lot to it, but consequently, you don't really see a lot of any kind of polymerization with cholesterol. It's just, here's cholesterol. Oh, let me change cholesterol a little bit. Now it's a different molecule. Oh, let me change it a little differently. Now it's a different molecule. Cholesterol doesn't really join together in chains like some of these others. So let's go and talk about some of these polymer units. The polymers of lipids are weirdly complex, okay? So the first one we want to talk about is what's called a triglyceride. This is actually really how animals tend to store fat, in triglycerides. You may have heard your parents or gone to the doctor yourself and had them be like, oh, how's your triglyceride level? They're very concerned about that because whether you have it or not, or how high it is, depends on how much fat you're constantly carrying around in your blood, which can lead to health issues. So the triglyceride has an interesting monomer composition. There are 3 fatty acids, and there is 1 glycerol. So these monomers that we talked about over here, you can see the fatty acids and the glycerol. There are a combination of 3 fatty acids and 1 glycerol to create this polymer. Now, all 3 fatty acids could be saturated, like these right here. All 3 fatty acids could be unsaturated, like this one right here. Or, like the example you see in front of you, it could be a mix, where some are saturated and some are unsaturated, okay? The most important thing is, if it's a triglyceride, it has 3 fatty acids. If one chain, one fatty acid is unsaturated, generally we refer to it as an unsaturated fat. So if one chain is unsaturated, it is an unsaturated fat. Okay? Now, there are other varieties on here. So here you can see the glycerol over here. And then here's my fatty acid. Here's my fatty acid. Here's my fatty acid. And then you go down here, and there's another way that we can assemble these things. And this other way is called a phospholipid. Again, it's a lipid. All right, so it's part of this organic macromolecule. Phospholipid's very similar to the structure up here. What you'll notice is right here, what I'm outlining in purple again, is actually my glycerol. Here, you'll note I have an unsaturated fatty acid. Here, I have a fatty acid, a saturated fatty acid. And then down here, I have my new unique structure, which is a phosphate group. Very similar phosphate group to what you see in the nucleotide structure, okay? And what ends up being important is that this is charged, and so this becomes a really weird molecule where part of it loves water and part of it doesn't, and that becomes very important in the structure of cell membranes. And we'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about cell membranes. Okay, so there's the polymer units, a couple of examples of polymers that lipids can make. The triglyceride, which is a glycerol and 3 fatty acids, which can be saturated or unsaturated. And then you also have a phospholipid, which is a glycerol, 2 fatty acids, and then a phosphate group, which gives it other unique properties. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what these things do. Now, the primary use of lipids is to store energy. Now, this is really important. Carbohydrates are primarily how you get energy. All right, that's how you get energy. That's where you find energy when you want to use it. But when you take in excess energy and you're not going to use it and you want to save it for later, for an emergency, for in case you can't find food, you store it as lipids. Now, this mostly happens in animals, but obviously like olive oil and vegetable oil and peanut oil, like we know that plants do it as well. It's just that this is the primary way animals store energy, all right? There is a big difference between storing energy and using energy, and that's important. There are structural uses for lipids. The cell membrane is made of lipids, and you have 50 to 75 trillion cells as a human being. A single bacteria is made of a cell. Every animal, pet, plant, everything has cells. So every cell and every organism on the entire world has lipids as the main structure of its cell membrane. So they're a very important structural thing. Now, on a macro scale, there's a lot of things that they can be used for. You always store fat on the outside of your musculature, and that's because fat can be cushioning. It can help, sort of absorb impact and stuff. Obviously, it's not necessarily ideal, but that is sort of the way it's done. Fat can also help you retain heat, like bears fatten up in the winter before they want to go hibernate. It's to keep them warm, but also because they're going to use that fat because that's how they're storing energy. And also, lipids are a primary source of communication between cells, specifically in the form of something called a hormone. Now, the thing about this is, maybe you haven't thought about this. If you have 50 to 75 trillion cells, and some of those cells make up your brain, some of those cells make up your muscles, some of those cells make up your heart, your stomach, your liver, your lungs, those things need to know when to do their job. And that means that those cells have to be able to communicate. And one of the primary ways that they can communicate is by using lipids. And when they do, the structures they use are called hormones. All right, so that's our lipid presentation.